The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Rahim. Thank you for joining us. Today is the 22nd talk in the series that we have um, on managing the shade basins. Last year in August, we started this, assuming that we'll continue only for a quarter. But the response was very encouraging, and we learned in this process that there's so many aspects that deal with shared water that we have to cover them slowly and steadily. Um, just to give you a little bit of more introduction of the series, then I'll hand it over to Dr. Ashraf, who will chair the session and moderate it, introduce the speaker as well as the topic. Um, Managing shared basins is very important for Pakistan because Pakistan gets most of its water from its neighbors, more than 80% of its water. And when we say sharing the basin, that's also between the provinces, upper riparian and lower riparians. And then this is also between the sectors, agricultural sector as well as the other sectors that are actually users, be it commercial, domestic, or industrial usages. As our population grows and per capita water availability reduces, we'll have to see what are different challenges in the water sector that we have. So with that thing in mind, we have done this. Every other week, we had the opportunity of the speaker covered one particular aspect, and you can pick one of the pushers here for our forthcoming talks. Our present plan is to continue till March next year, and this calendar is up to January. Our next speaker will be on 30th of August, who is a private sector expert on the hydropower potential of the upper Indus Basin, and he'll talk about the private sector investment there and the others you can speak to. Each talk serves as a webinar as well. Webinar means that it's live streamed, and there are some people who sign up and attend that. Typically, we don't know who has signed up, so we'll have to be at least bilingual. Sometimes there are foreigners and they don't always understand. Then each presentation is available on our website as well as the recording. You can see the previous 22, and then it's summed up in a small update, and many of them are displayed outside. You can pick the copies that you want. So in other words, it's not just the talk shop. It is a way for us to create a body of knowledge and a community of practice that helps us understand this. Today's topic, I think, is in a number of ways very, very important. It coincides with two researches we just released, one last week and one this week on the groundwater issues. And if any one of you is interested, you can see it on our website. We'd be happy to give you a hard copy. So without taking much more time, Dr. Saab, it's on to you.
Thank you very much, sir. First of all, I would like to welcome all the participants who has traveled and come here to just listen. Very important and very crucial, topic and presentation from the learned speaker. We know that groundwater in Pakistan is of utmost importance because it provides more than now 60% agriculture water, more than 93% domestic water comes from groundwater, and almost 100% industrial water comes from the groundwater. This is the importance. But unfortunately, this has been a neglected subject, both in terms of its management and governance. But we have been focusing on development side. Number of tubes now, it has increased more than 1.2 million. So this is very important, which now today MS Fazilda Nabeel, she is going to talk. She is basically postdoctoral researcher at the University of Sussex, and she has rich experience working with the different organizations, and also uh, she has been contributing a number of articles related to groundwater. Before I request her, I think it would be appropriate if we all introduce ourselves very briefly so that we know each other. So my name is Muhammad Ashraf. I have been working as the chairman of Pakistan Council of Research in Water Resources. My basically interest is the surface and groundwater management. Now, with the help of Sheikh Saab, I am also focusing on climate change and its effect on the water resources.
My name is Ali Tawfiq Sheikh. I work for LEAD, and my interest in water issues is primarily focused on three aspects. One is its very poor distribution because of inequity and a poor access to the poor. And then the hazards that it has made most of the population very, very vulnerable. So it's not, in my mind, the issue of quantity that's more important. Pakistan's per capita availability is more than per capita availability in India, in China, in Afghanistan, in Iran. Compared to all our neighbors, our per capita water is more than any of the neighbors. So it's not the quantity issues really. It's the issue of justice, water justice. That's it. Yeah.
My name is Ayla Sugir, and I'm doing masters in remote sensing and GIS, geographical information systems. And currently, I'm working with MODA on this project we have with US Embassy. It's called Rainwater Harvestation. This is being held in Chakwal right now, where rural women are basically taught how to store water and how to use it to the biggest advantage.
मेरा नाम राजा जावेद अली भट्टी, मैं 35 साल जंग अखबार में रहा हूँ। तो पाकिस्तान में पानी के मसाइल और मसाइल पर सबसे ज़्यादा मैंने लिखा है। एक छोटी सी एसोसिएशन ऑफ पाकिस्तान, एसोसिएशन ऑफ ग्रीन एग्रीकल्चर जनरल, इस हवाले से हमने सिर्फ लिखा ही नहीं बल्कि अपने इलाके में पानी के हवाले से छोटे छोटे काम भी किए हैं। अभी एक माह पहले हमने 40 कनाल में गहरा हाल चलाकर लोगों को कहा कि ये काम अभी कर लो, क्योंकि पिछले 2-3 साल से बारिशें ना होने के नतीजे में अक्टूबर के महीने में बारिशें नहीं होती और कदम जीरो हो जाती है उसकी ग्रोथ। तो अल्लाह के शुक्र अभी चंद दिन पहले बारिश हुई है और जो तजर्बा हमने किया उससे बगैर स्पिलवे बनाए वाटर की हार्वेस्टिंग हो गई है। दूसरा सबसे बड़ा इशू ये है पाकिस्तान में कि ग्राउंड वाटर के इस्तेमाल के फैसले सियासी होते हैं, इंजीनियर नहीं करते। एक काउंसिलर फैसला करता है कि यहाँ ट्यूबवेल लगना है और उसके नतीजे में बगैर किसी इंजीनियरिंग इनपुट के वो ग्राउंड वाटर बहुत नीचे चला गया है और 100 से ज़्यादा स्मॉल डैम की रिकमेंडेशन मौजूद हैं डॉक्टर साहब जो कि बारानी इलाके में बनने थे। लेकिन बदकिस्मती से पाकिस्तान में जो CSS क्लास है ये एक इजाफ बन गई है कि CSS का एक बंदा अरफन मौला अपने आप को समझता है और वो हर चीज़ का फैसला नेगेटिव दे के समझता है मेरी बड़ी इज्जत है। तो हमारे इलाके में एक डैम जिसके लिए बड़ी मुश्किल से हमने कोशिश की, उसका सर्वे हो गया। सेक्रेटरी ने लिखा जी कि इससे इरिगेशन एरिया कम है, हालांकि वो डैम बनने से ग्राउंड वाटर ज़्यादा बेहतर हो जाना था और बाद में सोलर पंप लगा कर या सोलर ट्यूबवेल लगा के बहुत सारे इलाके को जेरे काट लाया जा सकता था। मैं शुक्रगुजार हूँ लीड का जिसने एक रस्मी किस्म का काम नहीं किया कि एक प्रोग्राम कर दिया खत्म, बल्कि इसका सिलसिला शुरू किया और इस सिलसिले में मेरा और मेरे दोस्तों का सामान आपको
My name is Dr. Muhammad Arshad, and my research interest and area of research is artificial recharge of groundwater, which is now called managed aquifer recharge, within the framework of integrated water resource management. So, primarily, what I've studied is the economics of that technology, which might be relevant to Pakistan. On the topic, I have got 10 publications, sprinklers and peer-reviewed journals.
Locally, not my basic area is here, but I work on aerosols. I've been studying a lot about aerosols and how they can change destination patterns. Because the cloud condensing India वगैरह इस तरीके से aerosols के अंदर change करेंगे पैटर्न। Climate change is basically over Microsoft.
Muzaffar Mahmood Qureshi, I'm working government retired. I'm now trying to focus on three issues. One is poverty, the second is population. There's much discussion about it. And the third is some aspects of, you mentioned equity, the fault lines in the development programs and policies and how to reach out where needs are greatest, like trying to look at a few Kachibadis and disadvantaged groups of people. And water is now an issue which is not even being discussed.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Fawad Khan. I work with a research organization called ISET. I've been working on water-related issues for past 20 years, mainly starting with the view of looking at the environment and sustainability, but now getting into climate change, disaster risk reduction. I've also worked on urban water and sanitation and access to these services, both in urban and rural areas.
Okay. Thank you, sir. My name is Naveed Paul, and I am working with PCRWR as a research hydrologist. My area of interest includes satellite hydrology, and basically my PhD work is on satellite-based groundwater monitoring in Pakistan. So we have basically developed an algorithm through which we can see the changes, the seasonal changes, the monthly scale changes in our aquifers using satellite technology.
I'm Sanaullah Khan. I'm a PhD research scholar at NDU, and my theme is climate change as a non-traditional security threat. So, how climate change impacts availability of water and the other security-related issues that ensue due to climate change.
I'm economic analyst with this word research. I'm currently focused on pricing of irrigation water in Pakistan. So,
Sorry, where are you based, you said?
this is recorded research. This is recorded research.
जी मेरा नाम डॉक्टर मसूद अरशद है और मैं WWF के साथ काम करता हूँ.
My name is Burhan Ahmed. I am a meteorologist in Pakistan Meteorology Department. I'm working in Research and Development Division, and my area of interest is climate change diagnostics and antidotes.
I am Jahangir Ali, and I am doing my master's in water sources management from NUS. My research interests are related to extreme events, particularly heat waves.
My name is Malik Kamran. I'm in development Ministry of Human Rights. We have quite a new interest in seeing the overlaps between human rights and environment. So that's why I'm here. Thank you.
I'm Haris Mushtaq. I'm currently working as a research associate at Global Change Impact Study Center. And previously, I worked with the Pakistan Groundwater Apathy.
I'm working in the water resources section of Global Change Impact Study Center, and research interests are also in hydrology and water resources.
Yes, sir.
Sarim Jamal. I'm currently Sarim Jamal. I'm currently interning at the Asia Foundation. Currently, I am attending a bachelor's in economics and politics at LUMS, and I've worked on climate change policy for a bit at the National Assembly last year.
I'm Krishna Kundi.
I said Mr. Nate Makichand.
Krishna Kundi, and I'm working as a program officer at the Asia Foundation, and we're currently working in the area of water governance and also in the water energy.
Assalamualaikum, I'm Alina. I work here at Lee as the focal person for the water.
Assalamualaikum, my name is Kira. I am a YPO for Learning and Knowledge Management here at Lee.
I also work in.
मेरा नाम तो खुशी है, मेरा ताल्लुक ऑक्सफोर्ड से है. वहाँ पे मैं विमेन पीस प्रोजेक्ट है उसको.
Thank you very much with this introduction.
My name is Rabeel. I am a focal person here at Lee.
Thank you very much for this introduction, and I would request Fazilda Floor is yours. We have 45 minutes for your presentation. Then we will have so that we have plenty of time for discussions and question and answers.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today. Listening to all the introductions, I find myself completely inadequate to be addressing this group of learned people. What I will try to do in the next 45 minutes is try to share some findings from my doctoral research that I started in 2015 and that's ongoing. I'm by no means an expert. I think I was at Sheikh Saab and LEAD and the organizations that I've worked with in the past have really brought me to the point where I am today, but I'm still learning. So I'd request you, as you listen to the presentation and as you listen to my story of the history of groundwater development in the Punjab region from the 19th century to the present, please feel free to add to it. Please feel free to, when we're discussing it, please feel free to correct me where you would deem appropriate. Because for me, this is a learning exercise and a chance for improvement. My overall research looks at the problem of groundwater governance in the Indus Basin, or rather, groundwater non-governance. It's a contradicting term, and for reasons I'll explain as I go along. So I look at groundwater as a resource and group it under the overall theme of policy apathy. I say my main argument in this talk is going to be that groundwater as a resource suffers from apathy or indifference, despite its critical contribution to Punjab's development agenda from the mid-19th century to the present. This apathy or indifference exists both in absolute terms in and of itself, so taking groundwater as a resource in and of itself, as well as and particularly in relation to the policy attention and the policy urgency and the discourse around surface water in Punjab and in Pakistan. Just to give you an idea of how the presentation is going to be structured, so under the overall umbrella or using the overall optic of policy of groundwater apathy, I'm going to be proceeding chronologically, looking at sort of charting how groundwater was developed in the Punjab region, starting in the 19th century during the colonial rule, then taking it to the post-colonial era and how groundwater was developed immediately in the aftermath of independence and how critical groundwater development was to the agricultural agenda both in the colonial and post-colonial times, and how that aspect has been ignored by existing literature, especially in the colonial times and understated in the post-colonial period. The first two parts of the presentation sort of delve into the causes or the nature of this groundwater apathy or the policy indifference. We go over the various the subtle nuances, the way the state has nurtured this apathy or indifference. And then the last bit of the presentation, the case study, is going to focus on the consequences of this policy apathy. The case study is located in district Sheikhupura in Punjab, and it looks at how farmers in the rice wheat belt of district Sheikhupura, I looked at 3 villages. I'll go over the details and the methodology. It looks at how farmers in the rice wheat belt cope with groundwater degradation, so a deterioration in both the quality and the quantity of groundwater in current times. To give this presentation some context, I'm pretty sure everyone here is familiar with these statistics. Pakistan is the second largest economy in the Indus Basin, the 5th largest abstractor of groundwater in the world, extracting from the Indus Basin aquifer, which is the second most overstressed groundwater basin in the world. Official statistics, जैसे कि अशरफ साहब ने कहा, put 50% of the total irrigation mix being attributable to groundwater, 94% being used by agriculture, 6% by domestic, and a negligible usage by industrial sector. As has been mentioned earlier, I think this negligible use of groundwater in the industrial sector is very, very contestable. Industry contributes about 22% to the GDP, and agriculture contributes roughly the same amount. And industry in Punjab is almost exclusively dependent on groundwater for use as well as pollution. And I'll come to it as we discuss the case study. Punjab alone has about 1 million tube wells, almost all of which are privately owned. If you look at the red bits, that's the area where Punjab is, and that's the area. It shows the transboundary Indus aquifer, the dark red bits in the map. The area in Pakistan is almost exclusively covering the Punjab province, and something that's more interesting, this next set of maps shows a large part of this area that is under extremely high groundwater stress is also dominated by the production of rice, wheat, sugarcane, and cotton. These are the four major crops that dominate about 2/3 of the cultivated area in Pakistan. This is something to bear in mind, especially as we go on to discuss the neoliberal turn in the last bit of the presentation and discuss how government policy or policy apathy has actually facilitated extractive agribusiness as well as industrial interests. So, roughly put, what is policy apathy? What is this indifference that I'm talking about? Or what is this policy indifference that I want to highlight? Groundwater in Pakistan, as is the case with the rest of South Asia, is an individually mined resource. It is dependent on the installation of technology. There are no prior rights required except for rights to private property I'll come to the legal bit as a whole. The state-society relationship with groundwater only exists through the provision of energy, most of which has been historically subsidized. Even now, has been subsidized for agricultural use. The legal framework for groundwater use is a hybrid. It's mixed over colonial and post-colonial legislation, and does not clearly set out parameters for use. And so far, what happens is anyone with private property rights over land has the license to dig as much groundwater as they want, as long as they have the necessary technology to do so. So you can buy a canal worth of land and set up a water bottling plant there and mine as much as you want. What is even more alarming is that the government policy or policy apathy is in a way facilitating virtual water exports, making Pakistan emerge as the top groundwater exporter in the world. We are ahead of India and the United States in terms of our groundwater exports, which is quite alarming. 60% of Pakistan's exports are agricultural based, so either primary products directly or agro-based industries like leather and textile. So 60% of our products are agro-based and making us very vulnerable if and when our groundwater supplies run out. Apart from issues of over abstraction and quantity, there are issues of groundwater quality. Industrial and agricultural pollution is rampant, and a recent article puts about 50 million people, a quarter of the country's population, at risk of arsenic contamination. I think a very useful research agenda and a very something that's much needed is finding out the causes of this arsenic contamination. I imagine that a lot of it comes from industrial pollution, but I also imagine that some of it comes from the extensive use of fertilizers and pesticides and agricultural runoff. Of course, some of the arsenic that occurs in our soils occurs naturally. But I think useful future research agenda would be figuring out the components or the drivers of this arsenic contamination. What I'll do is, and I'll try to do it, I'll try to go over this part quickly. I think this is very dear to my heart. This part of my research is very dear to my heart, simply because it's an area that hasn't been covered before. And I spent a lot of times at the British Library digging up colonial archives and trying to really uncover the story of how the British approached groundwater. अभी तक ये है कि जितना भी काम colonial Punjab पे हुआ है वो सारा काम, all of it highlights how the British set up the mighty canal system and how the canal system really transformed the economy of this region, and how it led to agricultural commercialization. Lekin groundwater ka role during the British period has not been acknowledged at all. Yes, there have been some references to wells and the British setting up, experimenting with a few wells in Imran Ali's work and then a bit in Gil Martin's work, but there hasn't been a comprehensive study of groundwater in the British period done. So I'll quickly go over the main findings to sort of illustrate how my work sheds new light on the colonial approach and how that's in a way tied to the what we find in the post-colonial period. The relationship between colonialism and water in existing literature, like I said, has only focused on large-scale surface water infrastructure, canal irrigation works, whether this literature talks about the benefits of canal irrigation or the costs of canal irrigation. Canal irrigation led to all sorts of problems like drainage and outbreaks of malaria. Elizabeth Whitcomb talks about this in her research. But the importance of wells and the importance of tube wells to the British agricultural agenda have not been mentioned. Contrary to what the existing literature says, wells have been a very, very important part of the colonial irrigation mix. And the British actually invested considerable efforts in well irrigation. They were very strong economic and political imperatives for investing in well irrigation and later on in tube wells in the 20th century. And these have some lasting implications for what happens post-independence. I'll take you through a series of graphs that I've compiled from the archive. If you see, this pie chart represents the cultivated area according to the source of irrigation. In 1885, about 63% of the total area in Punjab is still barani. It was rain-fed. But even then, wells represent a significantly greater source of irrigation as compared to canals. If you look at these series of graphs, that range from 1885 and lead all the way up till independence, you'll see that the yellow area in the pie chart is the area. Out of the total irrigated area, the yellow area represents the area irrigated by wells. At that point in time, wells were, powered by animal power using Persian wheels, etc. But as the British expand the canal network, you see the light blue slices. The light blue slice in the pie chart keeps on increasing and the yellow keeps on shrinking. This shows the expansion of the canal network and the shrinkage of well irrigation. Of course, farmers were taking on the canal network was large scale, well irrigation was small scale, well irrigation was considerably more expensive because of the need for animal power, the yield was smaller, all sorts of reasons. That canal irrigation expanded over this time and well irrigation shrunk as a percentage of total irrigated area. However, in absolute terms, both canal irrigation and well irrigation somewhat grew, as you can see in terms of the area under cultivation and the total area under crop. The blue bit, the electric blue bit is the well irrigation, and I think the whitish bit. I don't know, the colors are not coming out right. But the orange bit is the canal irrigation, yes. So these figures suggest that, for the British, only canal irrigation was important and well irrigation was sort of relegated. It took a back seat. However, this is not so. Contrary to what these figures highlight, I argue that well irrigation and in the latter half of the 20th century, tube well irrigation was very, very important to the British agenda. Why? First of all, canal irrigation could not be extended everywhere, right? Canal irrigation followed gravity. It was a gravity flow system, could not be extended to upland areas. Well irrigation was very important there. Second of all, the canal flows were concentrated in the summer months and very, very dependent on rainfall for their flows. If you look at the history, statistics show that the Rabi crop or the winter crop had traditionally been a more important crop than the Kharif crop. So the Rabi crop represented 58% of the total produce of the year. And within the Rabi crop, one particular crop, and I call it the wheat agenda because it has links with exports to the United Kingdom. But one particular crop, the wheat crop, was particularly important on the British and higher up on the British agenda. So for the winter crops, well irrigation represented a very, very significant source of irrigation, particularly for the wheat crop. The wheat crop represented about 4% of the total, 4% of all exports for the Indian subcontinent, which is sizable. Wheat was deemed as the most important of all Punjabi crops, occupying a third of total crop area. It was one of the main exports, with the United States, Germany, and, if I'm not wrong, France being the top three importers of wheat from the Indian subcontinent. At that point in time, it was a grain that was consumed by the relatively richer farmers. Now wheat is a staple here, but at that point in time, very interesting to note, wheat was not a staple crop. It was only grown for importation. Thirdly, so I'll recount. Well irrigation was important for irrigating upland areas. Well irrigation was important for Rabi crops, and the third bit is well irrigation was very, very important as a form of resilience against famines. India, between the 1700s and the 1800s, even up till the 1900s, was struck by some of the worst famines ever. Now there are whole accounts of how most of these famines were caused by British policies, and Mike Davis's book is very interesting if somebody wants to read up on that. But in terms of dealing with famines, canals were particularly vulnerable in periods of drought because canal flows depended on constant rainfall. Tanks would also dry up during prolonged periods of drought. Wells appeared to be most resilient as far as droughts are concerned. So during the 19th century, what the British government did was they sort of tried to, in terms of their policy attention and the expansion of the canal network took up most of their energies. But they did pay attention to well irrigation. They did subsidize boring of additional wells. उन्होंने दो तरीके से अपने efforts को, so within the Department of Agriculture, their efforts concentrated on two main sort of activities. First, the existing wells were not yielding a lot of water. So during the turn of the 19th century, they used mechanized equipment to deepen the bore of existing wells to improve their yield. The second and more important were the tube well installation experiments. They gave incentives to private landlords to set up tube wells, figure out the economic feasibility of tube wells. I'm sorry, this flowchart is not very visible. I'll just summarize it for you. What I did was I tried to chart the history of well boring efforts as well as tube well installation efforts and the main hurdles that the British faced. The British invested a lot of time and effort in the Department of Agriculture, both to deepen the bores of existing wells as well as to install tube wells. However, they were stymied by a number of, they met a number of distractions. During during the 20th century, between 1900 and 1947, a number of efforts were made. However, they were met with two world wars and the associated difficulties of getting materials. 1914 में World War I हुई, 1937 to 1944 you had the World War II. So during both these times, the tubal equipment and tubal strainers were all imported from England. So both these times, you see that there was a lot of, there were a lot of difficulties in obtaining materials. Also, 1930s, you have agricultural depression. Tubers were installed at at the expense of the farmers. So, during times of agricultural price dips, the farmers were less willing to make these installations. How do you make sense of the colonial approach towards groundwater in Punjab in the 19th century, and what implications will it have for the post-colonial, environment, or what implications did it have for groundwater development after independence? The British invested a considerable deal in groundwater. However, their investments in the 19th century, up till the 1900s, up till the advent of the tubers, were limited. This is because tubal irrigation was traditionally thought of, well irrigation was traditionally thought of as a very small scale means of irrigation. Right? They could not expand it in the same way as canal irrigation. They could not profit from it in the same way as canal irrigation. They could not price it in the same way as canal irrigation. Tubers changed that, and we later see that in the 1920s and 30s, the British government is also considering feasibilities of installing tubers for municipal water supply systems and pricing the municipal water supply systems in the same way as they were collecting Abiana on the canal irrigation system. Of course, another reason was that the profitability from the canal irrigation system was way higher. So canal irrigation systems and investment in canals were yielding them returns of 50% at least on their investment. That's a huge return. There are, in the archives, they compare so you see there are a couple of Englishmen working in India trying to convince the home government for investing in Indian irrigation system, and they compare the return on canals to gold diggings in Australia. So they can compare the return on canal investment in India to their operations in gold digging in Australia and elsewhere. So it was a hugely profitable investment. And compared to that, well irrigation was, of course, they had to subsidize it. It was done at the cultivator's expense. It was not. The British could not profit from it in the same way as they did from canal water. Another sort of dimension as far as the treatment of groundwater is concerned, the British treatment, the state treatment towards groundwater is concerned, is the legal dimension. Canal water was always a property. So, according to the 1873 Canal and Drainage Act, canal water was made a property of the state. All water flowing, the waters of rivers, lakes, all channels were made a property of the state. Whereas groundwater in 1882 by the Indian Easements Act was always, it rested with the owner of property. So if you had property rights over a piece of land, you would automatically gain property rights over water flowing underneath. This was the first part of my research that sort of highlighted how the British approached groundwater, and I think the problem really was the British did invest considerable effort in trying to mine this resource, trying to expand it, in trying to make it large scale. The problem really was that it required finance. It required an incentive, which for profitability, which canal water had, and groundwater or tubal installations and the well deepening was missing that sort of underlying incentive. What we do see is that post-independence, things change. So the British made a lot of efforts in trying to achieve a breakthrough in tube well irrigation, but they were not able to do so until 1947. 1947 के बाद there comes a breakthrough in tube well irrigation. And I argue that the decisive factor that leads to a breakthrough in tube well irrigation is the post-Indus Water Treaty Cold War environment. The post-Indus Water Treaty Cold War environment and the availability of both international expertise and international finance, very generous international finance, first coming in as US aid, as a grant from US aid, and then later on in the form of a loan from the World Bank. This is what really sort of turns the region's groundwater economy, at least for Pakistan. So in the second part of the presentation, I'm going to go over this bit. And then after so I'll quickly sort of take you through the post-independence story, and then maybe give you a snapshot or some of the main findings of the case study in the next 20 minutes, and then whatever is left we can can come up in the discussion later on. Okay, so post-independence, some of the questions that come up is, how does groundwater become the newly independent state's most important worry? How does the Pakistani state play a historic role in the development of the current groundwater-led irrigation regime? And we also look at the critical importance in groundwater irrigation in achieving self-sufficiency, not just in food production, but also relieving problems of waterlogging, as well as sustaining high growth rates for agricultural sector in the post-independence period. We know that Pakistan went from having just a few hundred tube wells right at the time of independence to more than 1 million tube wells now. Groundwater has led to almost 160 to 180% increase in cropping intensities after the Green Revolution. In 1964, we were only using 8 million acre feet of groundwater. Today, it's over 55. Our ability to recharge the natural recharge is around 45 MAF. That leaves us with an overdraft that in some areas has gotten so worse that it's leading to about 2 to 3 meter decline in groundwater levels. This sort of shows the total balance. What is interesting to note is that groundwater it contributes a significant deal to the overall water availability at the farm gate. According to some figures, now the different reports show different figures, but I think a general consensus is that groundwater in Punjab contributes to about 60% of the water at the farm gate level. My own research in Sheikhupura shows that that's probably only true for the head and some of the upper middle end farmers. At the middle and the tail ends, groundwater contributes to between 80 to 100% of the water requirement at the farm gate level. So what happens as soon as Pakistan becomes independent? Of course, it's a fragile economy. There is political instability, economic instability. At the end of the Korean War boom, 1950s, there is a decline in foreign exchange earnings. Food imports cost about $700 million. Despite the fact that we were receiving food aid under the PL 480 agreement with the United States, but we still had to pay the freight charges for getting the grains to the country. The newly independent state not only had issues of dividing land, but also issues of dividing surface waters with India in the aftermath of the Indus Water Treaty. Now, surface water division was a very important part of the problem of water resource development in Pakistan, but an equally important part, and something that President Ayub was particularly concerned with when he went to meet President Kennedy in 1960 post Indus Water Treaty. Particularly concerning was the loss of productivity, agricultural productivity, or the rendering of about a quarter of land uncultivable due to the problem of waterlogging and salinity. So groundwater was looked upon by the newly independent state for a number of different objectives. The first and foremost was that groundwater provided a low-hanging fruit for increasing water availability and ensuring food self-sufficiency to reduce the amount of foreign exchange that we were spending on food imports. Groundwater was also looked at as a method of vertical drainage to remove or ameliorate the problem of waterlogging and salinity. And then thirdly, to achieve an increased agricultural growth rate for a primarily rural economy. I've come up with these three sort of overarching objectives using different, I can go over my methodology later when questions come up. For this part, I looked at 5-year plans and World Bank documents, government documents that talk about agricultural strategy for Pakistan around between 1950 and 1990. So, post-treaty Cold War environment provided the perfect space for President Ayub Khan to lobby for more funding, which President Kennedy responded to by appointing a special presidential panel headed by Sir Richard Revell. That led to one of the largest public tubewell programs with generous funding from the USAID and the World Bank. Pakistan at that point in time was not unique in receiving this sort of funding. So around that time, a lot of the country that had been under imperial subjugation were getting independent. और उस time के ऊपर बहुत सारे, so under Truman's 4-point agenda, a lot of Asia's many developing countries in Asia were becoming independent, and their development story was being sort of very carefully carved by external assistance from the United States. For many of the countries, they received money or aid or loans for river valley projects and dams. Pakistan also received a lot of money for the Indus Water Treaty and the Indus Basin Plan. But for Pakistan, an equally and more important problem, apart from the Indus Basin Development Plan, was the issue of waterlogging and salinity. This led to about 16,000 tube wells being installed under the public groundwater development program. But a parallel sort of development that happened, and a surprise development in many ways, was a blooming of the private tube wells, which quickly surpassed public tube wells and outgrew them by 1964. Existing literature sort of says that private tube well kya jo boom tha, that was a silent revolution, and they just quickly, there was the public tube wells had a demonstration effect, and the private cultivators quickly caught on. What I want to argue is that it was not a silent revolution. It was carefully orchestrated by the state. It was facilitated by the state using a mix of subsidies, both directly for tube well installation and energy use for agricultural tube wells, and indirectly by extending price support mechanisms for crops that required a lot of water, crops like sugarcane and rice that required a lot of water, and hence forced farmers or hence nudged farmers to adopt tube well technology. So there's both a direct effect where the government is directly subsidizing, giving out all these subsidies to for tube well installation, drilling costs throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s. And also they're giving out diesel subsidy, electricity subsidy, etc. But apart from the direct subsidies, there are also lots of indirect subsidies going through the price signals in the form of support prices for sugar and rice and wheat. The private tube well boom was also greatly facilitated by the local manufacturing of tube wells. There was this company called Vico, which first signed agreements with the British and American firms for the importation of technology and knowledge transfer, but then eventually started local firms in Daska, near Gujranwala. They eventually started coming up with a small-scale, low-cost tube well industry that led to the proliferation of tube well technology. So what I want to argue is that the state saw value in subsidizing private tube well development right from the beginning. So in the 1960s, third five-year plan ke under, and this is round about the same time where आपकी scarp tube wells जो हैं, they start deteriorating. The public tube well maintenance costs are start rising, and they start to prove to be not as efficient. The government starts sort of facilitating and subsidizing private tube wells round about the same time. Next, I think the next major turn aata hai story mein that happens with privatization. What happens is, I'll try, and I'm sorry, there's a lot of text on the slide. I think I should have told you, my apologies for that. But what happens is, in the 1980s, the World Bank is advocating all of these structural adjustment policies, privatization, deregulation, liberalization, and of course these policies are extended to the water sector as well. Water sector ke andar do main cheezein thi. For surface water, they're advocating decentralization, and we saw the range of reforms that led to participatory irrigation management. Farmer organizations ban gayi, water users associations ban gayi, area water boards ban gaye. For groundwater, in order to cut down on the state budgets and state resources that were going towards groundwater maintenance and maintenance of public tube wells, they transferred groundwater to the private sector. Now that was in the wave of, if you look at the global wave of ideas in natural resource management round about that time, in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, you see that a lot of the global discourse, the global development discourse, and especially the environmental management discourse, runs around community-based natural resource management. So, and that coincides with the liberal ideas of how things should be, how environmental resources and other resources should be managed. So with that, the World Bank advocated that the best way of transferring over resources was to give them to communities of farmers. They invited farmers to sort of take over the public tube wells at a very subsidized cost. In some of my interviews, I did find out with people who had institutional memories of that privatization of public tube wells. I did find out that so if the World Bank required a community of 10 farmers to take over tube wells, in reality, there were only 2 or 3 farmers, और बाकी सारों के ID cards लेके उनसे कहा जाता था कि you become a part of this community on paper, and asal में they were not really. It was more like a strategy for taking over the public tube well. The tube wells didn't last for a long time. the community tube wells didn't last for a long time. उनमें पहले ही बहुत सारे maintenance issues थे. There was an issue with the strainers. There's a whole range of literature that looks at why scarp tube wells started deteriorating very quickly. Some literature says that they got clogged up because of the natural corrosives in the soil. So there's a whole range of literature which talks about the deterioration in public tube wells. But the tube wells didn't last for a very long time, and the communities of farmers quickly disintegrated. And I think in my research, अब सिर्फ अगर आप local areas में जाएं field work करने के लिए तो सिर्फ निशान है उनके कि यहाँ पे होता था. And the older farmers, the elder farmers, they reminisce very fondly about those times कि हाँ जब हमारे पास गवर्नमेंट का पानी होता था तो हमें बड़ी सहूलत होती थी, especially the smaller farmers, because many of these smaller farmers, as I will argue in the case study, have to now buy water from their wealthier neighbors. What this did was, and what I think this transfer of public tube wells to the private sector, to communities of farmers, what this did was it sort of made the state retreat. In many ways, it absorbed the Pakistani or it absorbed the state of its responsibility towards groundwater. Conservation to pehle bhi nahi ho rahi thi. So even while, in the post-colonial period, after independence, they were developing groundwater. State role in the colonial and in the post-colonial period has been of a developer. Conservation to pehle bhi nahi ho rahi thi, but transferring that responsibility to community of farmers, it absorbed the state and it freed the state of that groundwater responsibility ke ab to, and sort of transferred everything over to the private sector and opened up this era of atomistic, individualized development of tube wells that was going on alongside, parallel to, ever since the 1960s, it was going parallel along with the public development of tube wells. But I feel that this formal transfer in the 1990s, 1997 under the Punjab private sector groundwater privatization program, really was a decisive sort of factor in absolving the state of the groundwater responsibility. Now, there's that's my sort of my take on this is that there is a vacuum, and in this vacuum, the state is facilitating a neoliberal sort of. The state is facilitating agribusiness and industrial interests. So neoliberal interests, extractive interests by two methods. So the first is using direct action. So there are policies that directly favor extractive agribusiness and virtual water exports. For instance, let's take the example of halal meat exports. 2014-15 की जो trade policy थी, उसके अंदर जो KPK की government थी, उसने 50% subsidy दी on the setting up of halal meat plants. And halal meat is one of the fastest growing exports in the countries. And meat, by the way, is more water intensive. So we keep lamenting, हम कहते हैं कि rice चावल मत उगाएं, चीनी मत उगाएं, but the water footprint of meat is about 1200 gallons per pound, if I'm not wrong. Whereas for rice and sugar, it's in the range of 200 to 300. So that is a directly so that's a direct sort of policy that leads to virtual water exports and groundwater depletion. Second, so that's one thing that the state is directly doing. Then the state is in a more subtle and in a more indirect manner, the lack of action on a number of fronts, the institutional, the lack of institutional ownership, the lack of a clearly defined legal structure for groundwater, the lack of environmental regulation or environmental legislation that prevents groundwater pollution. So state inaction is also leading to these powerful non-state entities to sort of further their own interests. To augment that, आपकी जो pricing policies है and subsidies, like I mentioned, there's a sugar, there's a support price for wheat, favorable prices for sugar. Then you have a huge subsidy on fertilizer. If I remember, if you look at the budget, I think this fertilizer subsidy is the single most heaviest item on the entire government subsidy. I think I do have figures for that. Fertilizer subsidies represent about 15% of the total subsidies for 2016-17. It's the single largest subsidy in the total subsidies budget, and with wheat and sugar subsidies falling at the second position. There's a whole range of, and it's not just for primary products, it is for agribusiness industries. अभी recently आपके जो 5 agro-based export sectors हैं, so textile, leather, sports goods, surgical instruments and carpets, of which at least I think 3 are water intensive: textile, leather, and to some extent sports goods too, but carpets. They have been included in the zero rated regime with special concessions on export and on taxes, etc. All of these, so direct policy action in terms of extending, distorting price incentives and extending subsidies, as well as policy inaction in terms of not having proper institutional framework for groundwater, not having a clearly defined legal structure, and allowing permissive environmental legislation for groundwater pollution and over-abstraction. That has led Pakistan to emerge as the top groundwater exporter in the world. So this is a recent paper where GWD is groundwater depletion. GWD stands for groundwater depletion. If you notice, Pakistan is, I think the relevant column would be, so I think the relevant column is going to be, this is the relevant column. So Pakistan emerges as, in terms of the groundwater depletion and exports, Pakistan emerges at the top, falling with India as the second, and I think United States, the United States as the second, and then India as the third. This puts us as number 1 on the world map for groundwater exports and groundwater export related depletion. Our top trading partners in terms of importing groundwater are mostly Middle Eastern countries, and so with Qatar emerging at the top, and other Middle Eastern countries following. I'll move on. I think the analysis in the last, in the first in the colonial and post-colonial period, it looked at how the causes or the reasons for groundwater apathy that have sort of piled up and crystallized over the 19th and 20th century, both as a result of colonial government policies and as a result of post-colonial, in the post-colonial, what I'd like to call donor-led, subsidy-led environment. The case study, I'll just give you a snapshot of it very, very quickly, looks at the consequences and how the consequences of groundwater depletion play out at a very local level. For the case study, I concentrated on wheat rice farmers in the Sheikhupura district. I picked up the Sheikhupura district because historically the water quality in the Sheikhupura district was very fine. It was the largest in a 1968 United States Geological Survey report. It has been termed as the largest area of fresh groundwater in the Punjab region. Also, one of the more compelling reasons for picking our Sheikhupura was that 99% of the district's agricultural economy is supported by groundwater. Not only is this district agriculturally intensive, it is also industrially. It represents a considerable water use. Officially, the Department of Industries, the local Department of Industries, holds that there are about 769 industrial units in Sheikhupura alone that are reliant on the subsoil aquifer both as an input to the production process as well as an outlet for pollution. And I'll just explain how. Most of these industrial units, I interviewed tube well drillers and tube well drillers. I interviewed the local environment department, the local industries department, Mary Patwaris, the land revenue officials, farmers. And these seem to suggest that most of the industrial units have the economic might to drill as deep as 700 meters, especially ice manufacturing units. Pardon. 700 feet, especially the ice manufacturing and the beverage industries. So I think I'll skip the methodology bit. If people are interested, we can have a discussion later on. But just quickly going through, my fieldwork was concentrated in 3 villages: Tusharpura, Kathiawala, and Chamsekam. These villages were located along the head, middle, and canal ends of the Jodianwala mine in Sheikhupura. I interviewed farmers, tube well drillers, district level irrigation officials, people from the public health and engineering department, irrigation department, industries department, environment department.
Like, you are already 10 minutes over.
I am.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just quickly wrap up. I'll just quickly wrap up. So there were issues with not only the quantity of groundwater that is available to farmers, but also with the quality. In the case study, I tried to document issues of access, issues of water justice, and found that water injustice is rampant, especially as groundwater becomes more scarce. Smaller farmers who cannot afford to install their own tube wells routinely have to buy water from larger farmers. There are, they not only pay cash, there are different methods of payment. They pay cash, they pay in kind to the larger farmers. The smaller farmers who buy water from larger water lords are also indebted to them, and they end up doing most of the farm work for them. There are other kinds of shocks. For instance, tube well theft was rampant. The government, under the Kisan program, the Kisan package, announced a subsidy 2016, but reversed it 2017. We found that the electricity subsidies tend to benefit larger farmers because most small farmers don't have the electric tube wells are much more expensive than the diesel tube wells. The electric tube wells cost about 5 lakh rupees for a single tube. The diesel tube wells cost about 1.5 lakh. So the electricity subsidies for tube well agricultural use tend to benefit the larger farmers. We also found that a lot of farmers were a lot of health issues and loss of livestock because the waters in the drain Nala Lake transpasses that area. The water in the drains is untreated, and it's untreated effluent. Also, industries which are not on the drainage network have a standard practice of digging unlined pits and discharging the effluent in these unlined pits, which then later percolates to the ground and enters the water table. So there were farmers who showed me that if they dig water from about 50 feet deep and they put the water in a glass and let it stand for about half an hour, the water turns yellow. And so the farmers have local knowledge of all of that. When the effluent is coming out at certain times of the month, it is so deadly that if their cattle go in the water, they just die, and the farmers cannot even go after their cattle because anyone who goes into the tree would be poisoned by the water. So there's all sorts of injustice, marginalization, not just by a declining quantity, but also by pollution. Better quality water, of course, comes to the farmers who have the economic might to dig deeper, and the industry that has the economic might to dig deeper. One of the most interesting bits in this research was how, in the absence of formal governance for groundwater, conservation activities are being led increasingly by the corporate sector. In Sheikhupura, quite a few multinational companies operate. There's Nestle, there's Engro, there's Mars Incorporation has a contract with an NGO called Rice Partners Limited. So a lot of because it was a sweet water zone, a lot of multinational companies operate there, and it's interesting to see how the conservation agenda is now being led by the corporate sector, which is noble in its own right. So the kind of work that Rice Partners Limited are doing, they're working with farmers on water conservation, etc. But in terms of the equity effect, I have this the flyer here, and what I found interesting was that farmers are posing with a V sign. I doubt if they know what V means, and if all of them emerge victorious as a result of these conservation activities. And some of the farmers that I interviewed, उन्होंने ये कहा कि जो ट्यूब्स दे के जाते थे RPL वाले, the tubes that were given out to monitor the level of water before they would actually irrigate the rice crop, to determine how frequently they needed the irrigation, the AW tubes. They said we don't use those tubes because हमारा traditionally the mindset has always been कि मुंजी को सूखने नहीं देना, right? So it's very and also the kind of the mechanics of these conservation programs is that smaller farmers cannot enroll in them. When I analyzed the farmers that were enrolled in this program, hardly a couple of farmers had land less than 12 acres. Most of them were large farmers. The small farmers are not economically independent to sell their output to an NGO anyway. They're dependent on that cycle of the money lender. वो आरती पे इतने dependent होते हैं कि वो इनको अपना output बेच ही नहीं सकते. So one of the things that came out from this case study was that smaller farmers were not benefiting from these well-meaning conservation activities, if you would like to call it that. So there were all sorts of, I won't go into the context and the a lot of detail on this, but there's all sorts of groundwater injustice. There's intra-sectoral groundwater injustice. There is intersectoral groundwater injustice, so between small farmers, large farmers, within agriculture. There's injustice between the agriculture and industry, so injustice between sectors. And there's research, we need research to sort of pinpoint where the injustice is tilting towards, whether industry is using more, because the traditional sort of wisdom has, traditionally we've only held agriculture to be accountable. The industry is holding agriculture to be accountable. I'm just wrapping up. And then there's provincial and regional injustice as well, because Punjab has most of the groundwater. And so export of groundwater from the Punjab region has implications for interprovincial injustice, especially when you tie it up with the issues that the 1991 Water Accord raises as far as the distribution of water resources between provinces. And then there are regional injustices as well, in terms of exporting water from Pakistan and the impact that it has on the transboundary aquifer. I think I'll stop at that. I apologize for going overboard.
You have some more conclusion or something?
Yes, that's
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't have a conclusion because I think my research was literally all over the place. So I think it'll be great if
you can just display if you have the conclusions. This is the final slide.
I don't have a formal conclusion. I think we just want to. I'd love to have questions and discuss anything and everything that comes up.
Okay, thank you very much for this very nice presentation. You have given us a complete history and overview of the groundwater development in Pakistan, particularly Punjab. One of my just not question, comments. You have not given any sort of recommendations to how we should, or the way forward, how the government of Punjab or government of Pakistan should move forward to revert the situation. This is one of my comments, and we can open the floor for any question.
So do you want me to respond to that first and then take questions?
Question ले लेते हैं. Yes, sir, please.
Did you think of any gender injustice in your research?
No. So my research was purely based on farmers in the rice wheat belt and I did not come across any women farmers. What we did come across was during the planting season, during the transplanting season, when rice is transplanted onto the field, women work in standing water, and because that water contains a lot of pesticides and chemicals they get and it's transplanted in hot and humid conditions, they get a lot of sores. Most of the time children are also there, they're lingering around. So what they've done is, again, all of these conservation activities are rather noble. What Rice Partners Limited and Mars is now doing is that they're focusing on bringing in women into these conservation initiatives, bringing in women, looking at their well-being. I think they've started running a sort of a daycare or a community child care program for the women transplanters, and also they're doing health camps. But I haven't looked at that in my research, primarily because the connection I was making was farmers' access to water and how it affects their how quality and quantity degradation affects their water access, and how it's tied to virtual water exports. But yes, that gender question has not been addressed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Excellent presentation, and I really learned a lot and enjoyed very much. And the way you have traced the colonial history on this. Allow me to share 2 or 3 reflections and comments. I'm not clear what do we learn from Sheikhupura case study. Is depletion more serious a business or a concern for us, or contamination or pollution, what you call groundwater? Both are serious, of course, but I wanted to see that what is operated in your findings, what is emerged as a more important concern for the local farmers and the communities there. For example, if I compare with, let's say, Kasur, leaching of mercury there has emerged as a more serious health issue, and therefore contamination is far more serious there. And mercury does not disappear in a decade or two. It's a years-long and centuries-long process. So there is a lot of industry. You mentioned almost 1,900 something. Are there any serious leachers or contaminators in these 900 that we should know about? That's one. My second question is, perhaps I don't want to be unfair in my question, But I think there are some studies that say that despite very heavy groundwater extraction, still the level is comparable to, if not higher than, pre-canal period. So before canals, the groundwater level was perhaps comparable, not fundamentally different. So in that sense, would it be fair for us to say that depletion is not that serious a concern for us, so long as we can learn how to recharge? And what kind of inexpensive or usable technologies are available to us to mainstream recharge, recharging of aquifers in these regions. And my third question is about export, because you mentioned export of virtual water, and that's a very serious business. I've seen a study that says that from rice, we export, we provide subsidy to European middle classes worth $2 billion annually. So that's the level of our export, virtual water export. Now, if we were to stop that, and perhaps we should, because water, we are saying, is a life and death issue for us. I don't know if it is, but assuming for a moment that argument is correct, should we prefer to retain that water in the country than having foreign exchange in our export trade, from which the common man doesn't earn too much, but big business houses do? So why to enrich them? Let's not have $2 billion extra dollars going there free.
Okay, I'll try to respond to them. I think depletion and contamination are both serious concerns, but personally, to me, contamination represents more of a concern at this moment. Firstly, because there are no studies on groundwater contamination that have been done locally. The arsenic contamination one was an international study, I think estimated through remote sensing or other methods. The other one too, the exports wali bhi jo thi, wo bhi ek international study thi. So my concern is that there is virtually, so when you talk to farming communities, you see how a certain region is a cancer belt. नहीं वहाँ तो सबको कैंसर है. अगर आप मुल्तान वाली साइड पे चले जाएं, सदर्न मुल्तान के अंदर, my sister, she's also doing her fieldwork. उसने बिहारी में अपना fieldwork किया. She's also doing a PhD. So her fieldwork was in Bihari, and she reported how she was with the USA. There was this entire belt of villages with a disproportionate amount of deaf and dumb people born deaf and dumb by birth. Now, this may be anecdotal evidence. This may be a coincidence, but there's certainly reports coming from the ground when you talk to people about how contaminated water leads to, it leads to lifelong disabilities for them. Whether it may be in the form of as something as simple as diarrhea leading to the death of a child, or it may be something more serious such as physical deformities upon birth. We don't know, because we haven't conducted that research. I think that really should be way up on the research agenda. Dr. Muhammad Hassan at LUMS, I do remember he's pairing. I think he's pairing up with either the PCR or one of these health organizations or the WHO. I'm not too sure, but they're planning to do something around the health impacts of groundwater contamination, because it is easy if you take district health data and you try to match it up with groundwater quality. Ab hum kar sakte hain. But it hasn't been pursued as a research agenda, and I think it's a very, very important and a very valuable one. So that was the first sort of question. The second saying your second comment about the groundwater levels being the same or higher than the pre-canal period, yes, the canal irrigation, the extension of the canal irrigation network did lead to a rise in groundwater levels because of the inadequate attention that the British paid to natural drainage channels, and that's what caused the problem of groundwater waterlogging and salinity in the first place. But I believe that if we approach it, if thinking that the waters are at best at their pre-canal levels, so we can be smug about our groundwater usage, I think that is irresponsible. That is in the same that's probably the same way. That's probably the same thing as saying that the annual increase in global temperatures due to global warming is only like 1 to 2 degrees a year. So what difference does it make? I mean, maybe it's not akin to that, but I think that the problem of depletion and of pollution is real, and there needs to be policy action to conserve this resource. Not just for as a basic human right, but also for economic sustainability and economic growth. One of the things that's glaringly missing from our growth policies, I also did like a sort of a textual analysis of our policy documents. Punjab ki growth strategy update mein, aur Sheikh Sahab Lead did a fantastic sort of session on that last year when the Punjab growth policy came out. There is no mention of water conservation, groundwater conservation. So our policies, if you look at our agriculture policy is long overdue, but if you look at the draft versions that come out, your trade policy, agriculture policy, irrigation policy, the irrigation policy, आपकी जो water policy है उसमें तो yes they mention the need to conserve, but these policies are completely dissociated from your growth policies are completely dissociated from the need to conserve this very important resource. As far as the export of virtual water is concerned, it's again a very, very difficult policy decision. So it's not just a question of losing out on that $2 billion. 60% of Pakistan's exports are agro-based, so either they're directly derived from primary products, or they are exports like textiles or leather or deriving from primary product based commodities. So I think if it's really a question of giving up that 60% or giving up a major chunk of that 60%, which is a very difficult policy decision. That's one. An equally important dimension, which is extremely political as well, is the vote bank, the rural vote bank. Yes, agriculture only contributes, now only contributes about 20-22% of your GDP, but it employs about 45% of your workforce, and it's the mainstay for about, or it's a primary sort of employer for about 50% rural population. 50% of the population is still rural. So the question of making a policy for groundwater is not really just a question for conserving the resource. It has political dimensions. It has economic dimensions. And that is precisely what the political economy of making this change is precisely what makes the change and what makes conservation impossible, at least in the present scenario.
I think Sheikh Sahab, one of the option would be growing the rice with less water, because now we have proved with the series of experiment and technologies that rice does not need standing water. It needs water like the other crops, and that water can be provided to the crop either by the bed and furrow or the sprinkler or the drip irrigation system. For example, actually the rice water requirement in central Punjab is 600 millimeters, whereas our farmers are applying more than 5,000 millimeters. So if we cut down those water supply, then we can grow rice at, I think, one of eighth of its original water consumption. So this is another aspect of this management. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Shahid. I'm sorry I didn't get, but I have a historical background of study. But I think my question is more focused on the policy based in the country. I think ownership of groundwater in Pakistan is overall, I think, it's even in Punjab, we try to actually convince the government. They have a draft act for so many years sitting on the table of the ministries and all that, but no solutions.
There's a recent one that came.
If there is no policy around the groundwater pumping, where to install, licensing, control, and all these, I think all these discussions dies out. So I think this is one of the important gap I think the Pakistan needs to consider. And secondly, most importantly, actually to understand the economics, as Dr. Sarfraz mentioned, economics around the groundwater, per cubic meter, the crop that we're getting from per cubic, I think we are the most expensive in the world. So can we afford to have that? Because, as you said, we are exporting a lot of water. This is the export that we are doing to so many countries. So I think this is another important aspect. Third, which is from the World Bank perspective, is that there is an effort that the World Bank is making under SMART. This is called the Sustainable Management and Transformation of the Agriculture. I think this is important aspect that the government of Punjab need to consider, and the other government need to consider that to actually transform this sector, and giving it as the same importance as they are giving it to surface. Although surface water is also neglected subject in the country, but I think groundwater is very early. So transformation of this sector by itself is very important. And groundwater especially. This is just
Well, I think so. I've seen the latest in the series of groundwater policy drafts, and I've been in discussion with the person who drafted it. It was an exercise that was funded by the bank, and the person who drafted it said that surface water is political. We know for the right reasons, transboundary relations with India and surface water being a zero-sum game. अगर हमने ना डैम बनाया तो इंडिया बना लेगा, उनके पास पानी चला जाएगा. But groundwater is also very political. So the draft, I asked him, when I read through the draft, I asked him, why is it so mild? And he said that anything that's, he said we'd be lucky if this gets passed. Anything that is even that's a little threatening will not make it through because of political reasons. Part of the reason is also because there's an overlap between political interests or political ownership as far as the government's concerned, and economic ownership and agrarian land ownership. I didn't really get your comment about SMART.
SMART is the government of Punjab's initiative. Actually, they actually wanted to transform the whole agriculture sector.
With the cell phones thing?
No, it's the whole transformation of agriculture, research, extension, irrigation. So they have some DLIs. These are called result-based. They have some results in each sector they wanted to achieve by actually cutting down the amount of the subsidies they are giving to different sectors, to agriculture sector, to other sectors. So there is a big transformation program. You should Google it on the World Bank website. Inside Punjab Smart Program.
The thing is that even despite, so I mentioned a lot of subsidies and price distortions, but it's the political economy of these subsidies is an entire different research subject. And it's very interesting to see that the subsidies only go to the farmers who are able to bribe the Nehri Patwari or the land revenue Patwari to give them the subsidy. The subsidies, so I remember there was a program where you would get an Android phone, the farmer would get an Android phone, and the farmer would receive notifications of the subsidy on his phone. Only the farmers who were in good relations with the Nehri Patwari and who kept him happy got the smartphone. So there's a whole like political economy to these subsidies also. We think of the government as being very magnanimous with the subsidies, but the actually subsidies escape the poorest of the poor. वो जो 12 एकड़ से कम वाला फार्मर है उसको तो पढ़ना भी नहीं आता. They couldn't even respond to most of your questions. उनके साथ जो उनका वो मालिक बैठा होता था या चौधरी साहब बैठे होते थे वही उनके behalf पे questions answer करते थे. So it's really it's a different world.
आपके पास baseline information भी नहीं है जो groundwater की baseline information है ये हमारे country में although there is some efforts being done, but even अगर आप पंजाब को देखें तो हमारे पास जो groundwater का status है वो भी किस जगह से पंप करना चाहिए कहाँ पे नहीं करना चाहिए उसका water quality situation क्या है वो भी
We don't even know how much water is being consumed by industry. Although in the latest जो अभी 2017 वाला industries का survey हुआ था, I think they were thinking of including a question on water in that, but I fail to understand how they'll be able to monitor industrial usage or estimate it without metering it.
So sir, एक ये है कि we have established a baseline for the Punjab. 4 doabs we have all completely mapped, and now we have the macro picture of all the water what is happening with it. ये हम अपना report share करें. Recently हमारी ये report 10 साल publish हुई थी. We have complete baseline of the groundwater. Or from here we can identify the hotspot. वो जो उन्होंने groundwater regulatory framework में भी when they mentioned to identify the hotspot first. I think this study can help to identify the hotspot. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I must compliment you on a very good analysis, especially your access to the old documents in the British Library and how the British were doing it. You unearth a lot of data information. But there are a few questions which arise in the process. The first, I think, is the use of the word empathy. It's appropriate, but it may not be appropriate. And I say this, I raise as a question, not as as a conclusion. That this could be apathy towards education, government's apathy towards primary health services, government apathy towards population. I can talk for 10 hours on the subject. So, what does apathy mean? Is it that they're not interested, and that people who take water, that people who take health, and people who education are not interested? Or does it mean inadequate action? Does it mean trying to do something and not enough, not going far enough? Empathy could mean that you allow people to become thieves and robbers, and you do nothing, or you have a police force, you protect some and not the others, or your police force is ineffective, and now you ask them to have their own private forces. So it's a word which is susceptible to interpretations, and it also reflect the attitude of who's using it and why, what purpose. Second, I would think that the point that was made over here is a fundamental issue. And you could blame the government now for being prone to political compulsions. But 50 years ago, things were different. Before the tube-well, shall we say, onslaught came on, things were different. Did the lifting, let me ask, the lifting report, which is really the foundation of the Indus Basin, did you talk about it? To what extent? What did they say? There's so many agreements that followed from that. Did they? Because I think this was not in the purview. And I jumped from there to Islamabad. Now, every home is sinking its own boring system, with the result that his home he needed 60 feet. His home he now has to go, he had to go 3. Now somebody has to go 600 feet. And nobody except this one solitary lady here who makes noise about this.
Helga,
right?
Helga,
and well, I mean, we dare not say this, I hope it's not being recorded, but one of the largest segments of the armed forces that occupied a huge chunk of Islamabad and indiscriminate pumping of groundwater for watering the lawns to make it green. And what happens? So, is it apathy? Is it knowledge, lack of information? I mean, the point is. Second issue, which I think, so legal is very important, and there is no debate on this. You mentioned the policy maker being a prisoner. But what about institutions? What about research body? What about universities? 180 of them, private universities. What about the social scientists and civil society? And this doesn't surface anymore. So whose apathy are we talking about? Is it just the MNAs who dominate parliament? Or is it the scholars who may or may not be landholders? They may or may not be employed, but it's just that they are not guided that way. I mean, it's fascinating. It's very important to realize how it needs some kind of. You talk of silent revolution. But some say it was silent. Why go call it? I mean, it was silent because maybe it was not propagated. But if it was part of a policy, then I mean, it's up to you to say it was silent. The policy led to something. So why use the word silent? The scarp, I think, is very interesting. And you talk of Sheikh Pura, I know Sheikh Pura, I was there many years ago when I saw scarp. The regulated, scarp happened because traveling from Lahore to Sheikh Pura, and you pointed it was like this. There's no mention of the design of scarp, the fundamental flaw in sinking tube wells. Others, Israel had something similar. They used something else, and we close our minds to it. About the whole system, and of course there were a lot of public acclaim because I was the president, I was the governor, and I took a lot of it, and I've done it. And the Sheikh, what's his name, Sheikh Chatta, he was recording. Maybe he still, I don't know if he still is. Every farmer said Chatta has given this land. The sponsor of SCARP, and he said this was Banjar and this water he's given to me. So the thinking for the short term was different. But then those tube wells became ineffective. And when you say they were given subsidized prices, low prices, it's not a favor to the new owner that the government was doing. How to get rid of it?
Yeah,
what do we do? So they could have given it free. They could have given the rent and charge something. So yeah, the point is it has been looked at in the context. And it's no different from government difficulties in dealing with PIA or the other loss-making institutions, steel mills, etc. What do you do with them? So it's not a question of a deliberate attempt at giving something at low cost to somebody so he can become a millionaire. We're trying to solve a problem which is a consequence of a number of decisions which were not well taken. And in the same context, you talk of Coke and Pepsi and Nestle, etc., etc. Why are they doing it? Not because they want to do good to people. It is not even corporate. What's it called? CRS,
corporate social responsibility.
It's because they would make more money or they would make less losses. And you can blame the British for the wheat. What do you call it? The wheat game, the wheat policy. And we can. So the question is that how do we make up? What makes Nestle alive to this problem? And to invest in it. First to educate Nestle, then to mobilize the community to do something. And why is it that others, why is it that Habib Bank doesn't, or why is it that Malik, what's his name, Riaz Malik doesn't, or somebody else should? So there is that. So that I think is not apathy, but it is we move only if we are driven. And since nobody drives us.
I thank you. I think all of your comments were.
Also, I must say something over there. The gentleman over there, he said he's talking about pricing of water. Now, I had something to do with Abiana rates, and I found it difficult. For a number of years, even a 2% increase. Now, Abiana, as you know, you mentioned canal as investment and more lucrative than a gold mine, which was so in the 1880s.
But not up to
and now that, let's say, even the maintenance cost of an existing waterway could not be met over the period. So it's not apathy.
You just let me to say some question from this side.
Yeah, fascinating presentation. I loved how you went through the whole history of groundwater versus irrigation. I had actually come here to listen to the cross boundary mining of water and whatever. But I thought this was much more useful. Being an economist and engineer, I could not help but look at the story from that angle, and it fits very well. We started with the Persian wheel versus irrigation, and it was like a gold mine. You said, the area, the amount, the economies of scale, the returns. I think that's where the technology comes in. When you had the Persian wheel and an animal, there's only so much you could do. Then you moved on, and as the story continues, I think that's where I found a bit of a misfit there, is when you went from in the current times, when we came back to renewables. So what happened was the impetus was building up a large dam and a quarter. I didn't know it was that big, because when we do, and I'm an economist and I've worked on water, when we do cost benefits of dams, we never put in the 25% of land that we put under salinity as a cost of a dam, which I think is very important. And that was a very good sort of point you put in there. The reason we took even more loans was because now the dam that we constructed that gave us electricity and irrigation downstream was now also causing water logging sanitary. So we had to take more loans to pull that water out. That was still not technologically efficient at that point, because electricity was not widely available, and also the diesel pumps were expensive, and like you said, they got clogged up. So where I see a problem is that the SCARP actually did not push us into going into groundwater extraction. And actually, we also said that in the end, when they were handed over to the people, they could only maintain it for a certain time, because of course the whatever the yield was not as good as the amount of money and electricity needed. But now things have really drastically changed, both in technology and then hence the economics. Electricity is widely available, and the efficiency of water pumping in the last 30 years has quadrupled. The efficiency. I mean, we used to have these Peter pumps, and I remember you put it on, it'll take you half a day to fill up your tank on the top of the roof. Now it takes 15 minutes, literally. I mean, you have these half horsepower pumps. They're like amazing. You can run them on a battery. They're so efficient. So if you go that way, it makes a lot of sense that people have, and also irrigation is, the expansion has stopped. There's no more reservoir. People have to find more food. There's higher population. People have come back. They've reverted back to groundwater. And there, obviously, with industrialization, your question was right, that contamination is a more of an immediate worry for us, because we'll spoil whatever we have, and we're already seeing signs of that. But what I also see depletion accelerating at unprecedented rates. One, because of the amount of the technology, the improvement in technology in pumping, the Chinese cheap pumps that are available. Secondly, energy is becoming extremely inexpensive.
There's the solar tube bulb, if
exactly.
you add that dimension.
So if we go to solar now, so there is already evidence in KPK, anecdotal still, that the solar tube bulbs that are made for drinking water, which make a lot of sense, are now being used for agriculture usage, because they're giving more water than that's required. And there's only so much you can drink anyway. And in those arid areas, the water tables are going down very fast. So there have been requests by other people who have dug wells and other means and hand pumps saying, please, you have to stop this, because we are all running. And Balochistan would be another story like that. So I see that there is increasing accelerated danger of, because that atomization, because of the improvement in technology and the cost cutting of electricity, that the groundwater pumping, even without the subsidies, will become very, very cheap.
There was the government wanted to subsidize. There was a program that was being initiated, but sort of nipped in the bud about solar tubal subsidization. It didn't happen, but solar tubers are freely available in the market, and that's why global processes. That's where global processes come in. India is freely uptaking solar tubers, and electricity for agricultural use in India is nearly free anyway.
Yeah.
So that these processes have a life of their own, and just like private tube well development in the 1950s and 60s had a life of its own, even without in the 50s there were no subsidies, but they caught on. There was a demonstration of that technology was being locally sort of developed, and people found it feasible to install private tube wells. In the same way, solar tube wells are now being locally available, and people finding it increasingly feasible to install some. Your comments are quite valuable. I think, especially also in response to the apathy question. I do in a present. I really appreciate that you brought it up, and I think in a presentation, in a 45-minute, an hour presentation, you can't really. I try to present 4 chapters of my thesis, so there are obviously going to be gaps, and I jumped over some things. But that question about policy apathy and whose apathy, and then has the apathy been consistent, or have there been ups and downs? How would I chart out the apathy from the colonial to the post-colonial and the contemporary period? That I think that's very valuable. When I talk about apathy, I talk about policy. So I mean policy inaction. But a very important dimension of this apathy could be civil society inaction. If you compare civil society activism as far as environmental resource conservation is concerned in Pakistan to civil society activism in India, there is a marked difference. I fail to understand how, and I think I'm still grappling with that question. But civil society activism in India has been able to drive out corporate interests. For instance, it's been able to drive out Coca-Cola from Rajasthan. And so in some of the critically affected areas where groundwater is increasingly scarce, civil society action has driven out multinational companies. They've also established a central water board which prohibits groundwater mining in critically affected areas, groundwater mining by industrial interests in critically affected areas, and the installation of new tubers. So I think for India, it has been a two-way sort of system where there was civil society activism and the state also supported that. For us, I feel that we पाकिस्तान एज हम जो कौम है हम निकलेंगे तब जब हमारी जैसे बिजली के मसले पे भी वी वर आउट ऑन द स्ट्रीट्स और हमने टायर जलाए और हमने बहुत कुछ किया. That happens. Just
take one more question because we started late, but we will finish on time.
Okay.
Okay. One question, very brief question, brief comment.
I just want to ask, how much farmers have you interviewed in your field, and what was the criteria to check the accuracy of the information you have collected from them?
Okay. So I interviewed between 100 and 200 farmers. In-person interviews, so I had different sort of.
Was they targeted interviews
no.
or
So
or like this?
my access to the field was mediated by Rice Partners Limited. I went in with them to one of their meetings where they were educating farmers about water conservation. So the initial set of meetings at the head, middle, and tail ends were conducted through them. They had 21. They had 7 at the head end, 7 at the middle end, and 7 at the tail end that we interviewed extensively. So semi-structured, lengthy interviews with them. But of course, I could not use that. Would have been a very biased sample. So then I branched out after that initial. That was the initial scoping exercise. I branched out and I filled out. I got about 200 questionnaires filled. Health focus groups got questionnaires filled that documenting patterns of groundwater use and how groundwater is bought and sold, and ownership patterns, groundwater theft, how groundwater swapping takes place, vis-a-vis your location in different parcels of land, etc. So then we did that survey, and then I had other follow-up interviews after the results of the survey. So I think in all, um, between about 50 in-depth interviews and about 200 covered in the survey.
Okay, thank you very much. Last
I will
question.
take just one.
Yeah, just
Not a very big question, very direct. One is question and one comment. Before coming to the seminar, I was expecting that I will hear something about that, how this research is going to inform to conserve groundwater in Shekhupura or other, which was missing. I don't know. Maybe you can better answer that. What is your research framework? That is my question. Have you already established your research framework to inform policy to conserve groundwater in that particular case study? Second is a comment. If not, there are very interesting analysis that can be done based on this background. The research would be very interesting if it feeds into the policy, that how it will inform the policy instrument, and then analyzing maybe different approaches, that how to tackle it. One is the policy analysis. Second thing is the technology, different recharge, treatment, other thing. So I think on these lines, if you study the overall economics of those impacts, that is the conclusion of this research.
I definitely see value in that. I think my research is based in critical studies, so it's not problem solving in that sense. What I do is I chart the development, so I chart the development of the problem, and my analysis presents different aspects and highlights different aspects of the problem and how we got to the situation where we are now. I feel that not all research has to be prescriptive, and not all research should be prescriptive. It's important to highlight the nuanced sort of causes of the groundwater problem, and then sort of maybe in a future research agenda look at the best ways of solving it.
One question from the audience online is for you. Is there any legislation about place of installation of tubewell in Pakistan? Imran Sheikh Saab ने सवाल किया.
Is there any legislation about the place of
the installation of tubewells? Where you can install, where you cannot install.
Well, in 2006, what happened was that the Canal and Drainage Act of 1873 says that all, and the Indian Easements Act of 1892 says that all groundwater rests with the person who has private property rights over the land beneath the water. The 1892, the Indian Easements Act. It's a colonial piece of legislation that's still in place today. In 2006, an amendment was made to the Act. So the colonial legislation said that anyone who owns land owns the water that's flowing underneath it. Of course, the water underneath my land is not confined to the one canal that I own. I necessarily abstract from other people as well. 2006, there was an amendment which gave, in the Canal and Drainage Act, which gave provincial governments the right to notify an area which would be critically affected, and then once that area is notified, then provincial governments could take action on limiting the amount of groundwater activity or the groundwater mining. But to date, it has been about 12 years since the amendment, the 2006 amendment. To date, the provincial government has not formally notified even a single district. What does happen is that the groundwater critically affected areas are dealt with on a case-to-case basis. जैसे रहीमिया खान का एक केस आया था irrigation department के पास, there could cement factories seen that were causing over abstraction. Then the Katas Raj temple case went to the Supreme Court, but mostly what happens is, even in the Katas Raj temple case, they've given 6 months to the cement factories to sort of find alternative sources, but I don't think anything is going to happen after 6 months.
This is a provincial act or a federal act?
The 1882 is a federal act. It was enacted. It's not.
The amendment was by the National Assembly or
the amendment was, I think, by the National Assembly. Because
In 1996 by the federal government.
It says a provincial subject. Canals and drainage act है वो provincial subject है. और groundwater act अकेला पाकिस्तान में इस वक्त है बलूचिस्तान को.
Looks like 1970.
कौन सी 1978 का है वो सिर्फ बलूचिस्तान का groundwater है. None of the provinces have any groundwater.
But it was an amendment to the canal.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, इसके साथ ही we are really thankful to Fazilda Nabeel for her very nice presentation and the way she has taken the questions and answers. It was really amazing and excellent. We are thankful to Madam for coming to us.
Thank you so much for your valuable comments. I think I will be reaching out. मैं शेख साहब से list लेनी है for all the people who came. I will be reaching out to some of you individually because your comments really made me think about, how you're into a piece of research for a number of years, and it really made me think about the aspects that I might have overlooked. It was a learning experience for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. आपका भी
इससे तारफ है कि नहीं? ये जो बैठे हुए डॉक्टर.
I've heard of him, and I think I've read it.
Everybody is very important. एक किताब तो दिखाइएगा जो मुझे दिखा रहे थे.
वो भी दसोगे जब मैं